I still remember the exact sound of the crash, the metallic shriek that split the air, and the way time seemed to stretch thin before the impact. I was driving just outside Savannah, United States of America, down a narrow road lined with cypress trees that leaned toward one another like they were whispering secrets. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where you almost forget the world can turn cruel in an instant. The radio played softly, and I was thinking about dinner, about how maybe I'd finally try the new cafe on Whitaker Street. Then, without warning, a truck in the opposite lane skidded across the center line. I had just enough time to gasp before metal collided with metal, and the world went white. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. Everything felt far away, as if I were underwater. My ribs throbbed like tight wires. My head was heavy, and there was a faint ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop. A nurse with soft brown eyes and a name tag that read Hannah Cole stood beside me. She smiled gently, though her eyes gave away that she'd seen worse. "You're lucky," she said. "The doctors say it could have been much worse." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and rough, so I nodded instead. Lucky. That word floated around the room, empty and strange. I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken, like someone had scattered me into pieces and left me to gather myself back up one painful breath at a time. My parents came that night, Lorraine and Victor, both dressed as if they were heading to a dinner party instead of a hospital. My mother's perfume filled the room before she did. She perched on the chair near my bed, lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just normal, you're fine," she said, almost impatiently. "We already planned a short trip to Europe, you remember? We thought we'd still go." I blinked at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say she was joking. But she wasn't. My father, standing with his hands in his pockets, simply nodded as if it were the most ordinary decision in the world, to leave their daughter, bruised and broken, for a holiday abroad. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside me, the only sound in the room that felt honest. They left 2 days later, after giving me a perfunctory hug and telling me to rest. I watched them walk out, my father's arm around my mother's shoulders, their laughter echoing down the hall. The nurse looked at me with quiet sympathy, but I turned away. I didn't need pity. I needed air. Days passed. Recovery was slow. Each breath hurt, and each night was a battlefield of painkillers, half-sleep, and memories I didn't want to touch. My body healed, but something deeper inside me started to wake up, something sharper, older. It was the kind of awareness that comes when you've finally seen people for who they are. They called me once from Paris, sending me a picture of themselves smiling by the Seine. "See, sweetheart," my mother said over the phone. "You'd love it here. You really shouldn't be moping." I wanted to scream that I'd nearly died, that the sound of breaking glass still haunted me, that I couldn't stand how easily they had moved on. But instead, I hung up. I lay back in bed and let the silence close in. When you almost die, you start to see what really matters, and who never did. I began remembering all the little betrayals I had brushed aside, the lost college fund that disappeared right after my father's bad investment, the checks I'd signed because they said they needed help, the years of being told I owed them everything. They had always seen me as their safety net, not their child. Then I remembered something else, something that changed everything. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, the only person who had ever loved me without conditions, had left me her estate in a trust. Last spring, I'd met with attorney Marcus Bell, a calm, deliberate man with kind eyes, to update the papers. According to the will, I would gain full control of the assets once I turned 25. I had turned 25 in May, just weeks before the crash. The documents were signed, sealed, and filed. I had never mentioned it to my parents, mostly out of fear and habit. But that fear had burned away on the asphalt that night. The thought lit a slow, quiet fire inside me. Everything they owned, the house, the cars, the savings accounts, was under the umbrella of that trust. They had lived off it for years, never realizing that they were living in my shadow. My grandmother had protected me even after her death, perhaps knowing one day I would need it. I began planning while still in recovery. Marcus came to see me one afternoon, his leather briefcase resting neatly beside the bed. He reviewed the papers, explaining in his calm lawyer's voice that yes, everything was legally mine. My parents had no claim. He asked if I was sure if I understood what I was doing. I looked at the faint bruise on my wrist from the foreneedle and nodded. I was sure. For the first time in my life, I was completely sure. Hannah, the nurse, became my small piece of kindness in those days. She often brought me an extra cup of tea when her shift ended and told me stories about her dog back home. She said I reminded her of her sister, quiet but stubborn. When I was discharged, she hugged me and said, "Go live. Don't waste your second chance." I promised her I would, though I didn't tell her what that meant. Back in my apartment, I stood by the window and watched the city lights blink through the evening haze. My phone buzzed with another message from my mother, a photo of her holding a glass of champagne in Nice. The caption read, "Wish you were here, darling." I stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. That night, I opened the drawer where I'd kept my grandmother's papers. I spread them out on the table, my fingers tracing the embossed seal, the careful handwriting, the love hidden between legal phrases. My name looked stronger in ink than it had ever sounded from their mouths. By dawn, I knew what I would do. I called Marcus and said, "Sell everything." There was a pause, then a quiet understood. I hung up and felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. For once, I wasn't the frightened daughter waiting for approval. I was the owner, the survivor, the one with the pen. As sunlight crept into the room, I realized that I wasn't just recovering from a crash. I was waking from a long sleep, the kind where you forget who you are because someone else has told your story for too long. Now, I would write my own. Everything they lived in and lived on was mine. They just didn't know it yet. It took nearly 3 weeks after the crash before I could walk without feeling as though the world tilted slightly beneath my feet. The doctor said my bones had healed well, but my nerves hadn't caught up. Every step felt uncertain, as if the floor could suddenly shift away. But I was impatient. I didn't want to lie still anymore, not when I had so much to undo. When I finally called Marcus Bell, my attorney, he arrived that same afternoon, punctual as always. He was tall, precise, the kind of man who ironed not just his shirts but also his words. He carried a thin leather folder and spoke in the calm tone of someone who handled other people's storms for a living. "You have the right to liquidate," he said after reading through the trust documents. "Everything, the house on Cypress Lane, the lake cabin near Burlington, and the brokerage account. They're all listed under your name. Your grandmother was meticulous. I have the seals, and the signatures are valid." I remember feeling the first spark of something that almost frightened me: power. For so long, I had lived like a visitor in my own life, tiptoeing around my parents' moods and mistakes. But now, with one signature, I could take back everything. Marcus noticed my silence and closed the folder carefully. "You don't need to decide today," he said gently. But I had already decided. That evening, Hannah, the nurse who had become my only real friend through recovery, offered to drive me to the house. Her little car smelled faintly of mint gum and lavender. As we pulled up to the white brick house with the green shutters, my stomach twisted. It was beautiful in the kind of way you could never quite love. Polished, perfect, pretending. The porch swing creaked in the wind, empty and still. It had never held me on the nights I cried alone. Not once. I walked through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Everything was where I remembered it. The photo of my parents smiling in Cleveland, the crystal vase I'd once knocked over and paid for with a week's allowance, the faint scent of lemon polish that my mother adored. The house was a museum of pretense, built not for warmth but for performance. I stood in the living room and thought, this was never home. It was a stage, and I was the prop that no one clapped for. The next day, I contacted Eliza Shore, a real estate agent from Charleston whom Marcus recommended. She arrived in sharp heels and an even sharper smile, her clipboard already half-filled. "We can list fast," she said after a single walkthrough. "The market in Savannah is strong right now. White brick and green shutters. Classic Southern charm. It'll go quick if we price right." We decided on $940,000 for the house. The cabin near Burlington, smaller but idyllic, would list at $320,000. Eliza moved through the process like a conductor leading a quiet orchestra, photographers, stagers, inspectors. I signed papers until my wrist ached. The for sale sign went up within the week. Seeing it there, planted in the front lawn, was like watching a gravestone rise. But it wasn't mine, it was theirs. While Eliza handled the listings, Marcus guided me through the finances. The brokerage account my parents had once called rainy day funds turned out to be a gold vein buried beneath lies. My grandmother had invested carefully for decades, and the portfolio had grown quietly while I was too afraid to look. Marcus explained the numbers in simple terms. After liquidation and fees, I would have roughly $1,180,000 transferred into my own account. When I saw the balance appear on my phone screen, those long strings of digits, I almost didn't believe it. I had never held that kind of money before. It didn't feel real. It felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. But money wasn't the point. Control was. I had spent years being told I was ungrateful, dramatic, too emotional, that I didn't understand the real world. Now, the real world was mine to shape. I sold their old sedan next. The navy one my father had insisted was a family car but never let me drive. A man from a used dealership in Augusta handed me $4,200 in crisp bills, and I felt a small, private thrill. Each sale chipped away at the life they had built on my silence. At night, the apartment felt too quiet. I'd sit by the window, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and watch the city hum below. Sometimes I'd write in a notebook, words I wasn't brave enough to send. One of those letters began, "You told me I was dramatic. You told me pain was noise. You told me love keeps score. Now I hold the scorecard." The process of selling everything took a month, though it felt like years compressed into days. Eliza sent me updates every few hours. Offer on the cabin came in at asking. New buyers from Florida interested in a quick close. House inspection clean, we're moving fast. Her efficiency was surgical. By the time my parents were posting pictures from Venice, smiling beside gondolas and wine glasses, everything they owned was already halfway gone. One evening, as I sorted through old papers in the attic, I found a dusty shoebox marked Margaret's letters. My grandmother's handwriting spilled across faded envelopes. I opened one, dated 12 years earlier. Inside, she'd written, "I hope one day you learn that love is not debt. Protect yourself, even from those who say they love you most." I pressed that letter against my chest and cried for the first time in weeks, not from grief, but from recognition. She had known. She had seen the truth before I could. When the final wire transfer cleared, Marcus came to my apartment again. He placed a single document on the table. "Everything is settled," he said. "The properties are sold. The funds are yours." He hesitated, then added, "Are you planning to stay here, or?" I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I'm leaving." "Where to?" "Somewhere that doesn't look like them." He nodded and, for once, didn't ask another question. That night, I opened a map and traced my finger along the coastlines of Europe, names I'd only read about before. Monaco, Nice, Barcelona, places that shimmered like promises. I circled Monaco. It wasn't a plan yet, just a whisper. But it was enough. I closed the map, looked around the bare apartment, and realized I felt light for the first time in my adult life. Every item I had sold was a piece of a past that never belonged to me. Now, only I remained, and the future I would buy on my own terms. As I drifted to sleep, I thought of the road outside Savannah, the crash, the light that had almost gone out. Maybe that moment wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning, the violent, necessary breaking of an old shell. And in that quiet, I promised myself I would never belong to anyone's story again but my own. I knew where I would go long before I packed a single suitcase. Monaco, a name that shimmered in my mind like sunlight caught in glass. I'd seen photos of it once in a travel magazine in the waiting room of Marcus Bell's office. Steep cliffs, blue water that looked almost unreal, and streets that seemed carved from light itself. Back then, it had felt impossibly far away, a dream stitched into someone else's life. Now, with the money safely in my account and my old world burned clean behind me, it was the only place that made sense. I booked a one-way ticket from New York to Nice, first class, something I had never dared to imagine before. The price, $7, $800, barely made a dent in the balance, but what mattered wasn't the seat or the champagne or the soft blanket. What mattered was that the ticket said one way, no return. When I boarded, the air inside the plane smelled of coffee and quiet wealth. I pressed my hand against the window before takeoff, watching the lights of New York flicker like restless stars. For a moment, I thought of my parents in their house, or what used to be their house, coming home to find empty rooms, their voices echoing against walls that no longer belonged to them. The thought didn't bring me guilt. It brought me peace. The flight itself felt timeless. I didn't sleep. I watched the Atlantic slide below like an unbroken mirror and thought about the past as if it belonged to someone else. By the time the plane touched down in Nice, dawn had just begun to bloom across the horizon, washing everything in pale gold. I walked out of the airport with only 2 bags and a new passport case that still smelled of leather. A driver named Daniel Price met me outside, holding a small sign with my name on it. He was young, talkative, the kind of person who believed silence was a gap that needed filling. "First time in Europe?" he asked as he loaded my bags into the trunk. "Yes," I said, watching the sun rise over the distant sea. "You'll love Monaco. It's small, but it feels like the world fits inside it. Everyone's got a story there." I almost laughed. I think I've had enough stories for a while. The ride along the coast was quiet after that. The light off the water looked sharp enough to cut. I rolled down the window and let the wind whip through my hair. The air smelled like salt and citrus. Somewhere between Nice and Monaco, I felt something loosen inside me. A slow exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. When Daniel pulled up in front of the building I'd chosen, a pale stone structure with wrought iron balconies and terracotta roofs, I felt a strange surge of belonging. It wasn't home yet, but it could be. The studio was small but bright, perched above a narrow street that wound its way toward the harbor. The rent was £2,900 a month, and I paid the deposit and 3 months up front without hesitation. I didn't even flinch at the total. Money had become weightless, no longer tied to fear. Inside, the walls were white and bare, waiting for something to make them real. I bought the essentials: a kettle, 2 bowls, a wooden chair, and a small green plant that looked stubborn enough to survive anything. I didn't need much. I was learning to live lighter. The days in Monaco moved differently. Morning light came early, spilling through my window like water. I started walking by the harbor each day, watching the yachts glitter like small palaces. I began naming them silently as I passed: Quiet, Boundaries, Truth. Each name felt like a small prayer. At night, I'd sit on my balcony with a notebook, writing letters I never sent, to my parents, to my grandmother, to the version of myself who used to apologize for existing. Sometimes I wrote nothing at all, just listened to the distant hum of the sea and the laughter of strangers below. Still, I wasn't completely free yet. There was one last thread that tied me to them: a storage unit in Cleveland, filled with furniture and boxes from their so-called good years. My mother's vanity table, my father's leather armchair, old photo albums that only showed their smiles. I called Eliza Shore, the real estate agent who had handled the house sale, and asked if she could arrange to liquidate it. "Eliza Shore speaking," she answered brightly when she picked up. "Eliza, it's me. I need one more thing sold, the storage unit in Cleveland." There was a brief pause. All of it, I said. "Sell it as a lot. I don't want anything back." Within 2 weeks, she found a buyer who offered $18,600 for everything. She sounded apologetic, as if she thought the number might offend me. But I didn't care if it had been half that. I didn't want the money. I wanted the absence. When she wired the payment, I deleted every photo I had left of those rooms. The only thing I kept was a photograph of my grandmother, Margaret Hale, standing in her garden, wearing a blue dress and holding a book to her chest. The edges were worn soft, but her eyes were as alive as ever. I placed it on the windowsill beside the plant. Every morning I said, "I made it, Grandma." When the last sale cleared, Marcus sent me a final statement. My total balance after all transactions was $2,164,300. I stared at the number for a long time. It looked surreal, like a lie written in perfect handwriting. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and laughed once, a small, cracked sound that turned quickly into tears. I cried the way the sea breathes, in and out, steady, endless. That night, I took a long walk through the narrow streets of Monaco. The city glowed as if made of melted gold. I passed cafes where people spoke softly in French, their laughter rising like music. I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt invisible, and somehow that was freedom too. I found a bench overlooking the harbor and watched the reflections tremble in the dark water. Somewhere behind me, a violin played from a balcony. The sound drifted down like a lullaby, and for the first time since the crash, my body relaxed completely. I thought about my parents, not with anger, but with distance, as if they were characters in a story I'd once read and forgotten. They would come home soon, I knew, and find everything gone. Maybe they'd call Marcus. Maybe they'd hire someone to track me. But they wouldn't find me here. Not in Monaco. Not in this quiet, sunlit corner of Europe where I finally felt like my own person. Freedom doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with silence, the kind that feels earned. As I watched the lights of the yacht sway, I realized I wasn't running anymore. I was simply moving forward at last. They came back to America at the end of the month. I knew it before they even told me, knew it from the sudden flood of messages that lit up my phone one night like a storm at sea. The first was from my mother, "Where are you? Call us now." Then my father, "We can fix this." Then numbers I didn't recognize, friends of theirs maybe, their tones switching from confusion to desperation to anger. By midnight there were dozens. My screen filled with their voices, pleading, demanding, bargaining. I didn't reply. I watched the notifications appear and fade, one after another, until the phone finally went dark. Then I wrote one message, just one, and sent it to both of them. "You told me after the crash that it was just normal. It was not. You told me I owed you my life. I do not. You spent my trust and called it love. I sold the house and the cabin and the stocks because they were mine. I have left for Monaco for good. Do not look for me. Do not write to me. You are out of my life forever." I pressed send, and in that single motion, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been clenched since childhood. Then I blocked their numbers. It was so quiet afterward that I could hear the wind through the open balcony door and the faint hum of the sea below. The next morning, I woke early, before the first hint of sunrise. I made tea in the small silver kettle I bought my first week here, the kind that whistles softly when it's ready. Steam curled into the air, carrying the scent of mint. I carried my cup to the balcony and watched the water glow as the light climbed over the cliffs. Monaco at dawn looked like the edge of another world, clean, bright, and new. I had a notebook, a plain one I'd bought at a corner shop near the harbor. I began writing in it every morning, not grand things, just small details of the day. A boy kicking a ball in the square, a woman in a red coat laughing into her phone, a stray cat that wandered up from the marina and decided my lap was its favorite place to sleep. I filled pages with simple sentences, proof that I was alive and choosing to be. A week after sending the message, I found work at a small art shop near Rue Princesse Antoinette. The owner, Clara Reed, was a kind woman in her 40s who had come from Boston years ago and never gone back. She sold watercolor sets, sketchbooks, and tiny sculptures to tourists and locals alike. When I walked in looking for a job, she studied me for a long moment, then smiled. "You have the eyes of someone who needs to start over," she said. She offered me part-time hours at $28 an hour, more than fair for the quiet rhythm of the place. Clara let me hang my sketches in the back corner of the shop. Simple pencil drawings, boats, buildings, faces I saw once and never again. Sometimes people bought them, slipping euros or pounds into the little box marked local artists. Each sale felt like a small acknowledgement that I existed here, not as someone's daughter or burden, but as myself. The city began to feel like mine. I learned where the best bread was baked, at a small place called Le Ciel du Pain, where the baker always greeted me with bonjour, sunshine. I found a narrow staircase near the old fortress that led to a hidden terrace overlooking the sea, and that became my refuge on quiet afternoons. I spent hours there, sketching, reading, or just breathing. Every once in a while, I'd dream about my parents. In those dreams, they were standing in front of the old house in Savannah, the porch swing behind them still creaking in the wind. My mother would be crying, my father shouting words I couldn't hear. I'd wake with my heart pounding, but instead of fear, I felt only distance. The kind that means you've finally crossed the ocean between who you were and who you've become. I no longer checked the American news or social media. I didn't want to see if they were looking for me, didn't want to know if they'd spun their own version of the story. The truth belonged to me alone now, and I guarded it quietly. Sometimes I walked to the border at dusk, where Europe leans down to kiss the sea. The water there turns the color of melted gold just before the light fades. I would stand there and think about all the places I'd been. The hospital in Savannah, the quiet apartment where I signed the papers, the long road to freedom. I would whisper thank you to my ribs for healing, to my hands for signing, to my grandmother for giving me the means to escape. Life became small, deliberate, peaceful. I learned how to cook for one, how to live without apology. My days were steady. Morning tea, work, sketches, evening walks. The simplicity was a kind of prayer. And yet, sometimes at night, when the world was completely still, I'd reach for the small dish on my bedside table. In it lay one object, the key to the old house on Cypress Lane. It was smooth and cool against my palm, the metal worn from years of use. It opened nothing now. It belonged to no door, no life I lived anymore. But I kept it, not out of longing, but as a reminder. It reminded me that the things we let go of still shape us. That the endings we choose are the beginnings we earn. I looked out over the sleeping city, the sea breathing softly below, and whispered to the night, I am the one who chooses the house. I am the one who writes the story. And I am the one who leaves. The wind carried my words away, and for once, I didn't need them back.